My sister raised her glass and said it out loud, calling me a mistake in front of everyone at the table, and no one interrupted her. I felt my face burn before I understood why the room had gone quiet. Someone laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, but in that soft way people laugh when they think they are allowed to. The sound came from the far end of the table, bounced once off the walls of my parents' house in Santa Cruz, and disappeared, leaving behind something heavier than silence. The table was full, too full, plates crowded with food no one would finish, glasses already half empty, elbows brushing, knees touching under the wood. It was one of those family dinners that was supposed to feel warm and celebratory, the kind my mother planned weeks in advance. She had lit candles even though it was still light outside, wiped the counters twice, rearranged the chairs so no one would feel left out. I already felt left out. I always did. My cousin had just announced her engagement, and everyone was clapping, asking questions, leaning forward. I smiled when it felt appropriate, nodded when someone glanced at me, kept my hands folded in my lap so I wouldn't fidget. I had learned over years how to exist quietly among people who never quite knew what to do with me. Then my older sister stood up. She tapped her glass with a fork, still smiling, cheeks flushed from wine. She liked attention, liked the way people leaned in when she spoke. My mother beamed at her. My father adjusted his posture. She began by saying how proud she was of this family, drawing it out slowly. It was a safe start. Everyone relaxed. She looked around the table, then her eyes stopped on me. It was brief, just a second too long, but I noticed. I always noticed. She continued, laughing softly, saying that most of us turned out exactly how we were supposed to. There was a pause. Then she shrugged and added that there was proof that not every plan works out. Her gaze didn't move this time. I felt it before I heard it, the word mistake. She didn't even say it loudly. She said it like it was obvious, like it was something we had all silently agreed on years ago, and she was just finally saying it out loud. A mistake. The room reacted in fragments. A small laugh. A cough. Someone shifting in their chair. My aunt murmured her name in warning, but there was no real anger in it. My mother smiled, that tight smile she used when she didn't want to correct anyone too harshly. She waved her hand and told her to stop, still smiling. My father stared into his glass. No one looked at me directly, and somehow that hurt more than if they had. It was like I had been erased without leaving my seat, like the space I occupied had suddenly become theoretical. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't cry. I never cried in front of them. Crying only confirmed things. So I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and waited for the moment to pass, the way I always did. It passed quickly. Someone changed the subject. Plates clinked again. Conversation resumed. The mistake had been named, acknowledged, and then neatly folded away like a napkin, no longer needed. I finished my food even though I wasn't hungry. I thanked my mother for dinner. I hugged people who leaned in automatically, their arms stiff, their faces already turning away. When I finally left, no one tried to stop me. In the car, I sat for a long time without starting the engine. My hands were shaking, but my face was dry. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, one word spoken so casually, could feel like confirmation of something I had suspected my entire life. I sat there longer than I needed to. The dashboard light stayed off. The house behind me glowed softly through the windows, warm and alive without me. I could still picture them inside, plates being cleared, someone pouring another drink, laughter returning in small, careful doses, as if nothing irreversible had just happened. I wondered, briefly, if anyone would mention it once I was gone. If my sister would apologize quietly to someone else. If my mother would say I was sensitive. If my father would say nothing at all. I learned that whatever story they told afterward would not include how it felt to be me in that moment. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away, the sound of tires on pavement grounding me more than anything they had said that night. That night, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. There was no one to tell. I had always been the extra piece in my family, the child who didn't fit cleanly into their story. I was quieter than they expected, slower to settle, less impressive on paper. I didn't bring home trophies or promotions or partners they could brag about. I brought questions, hesitation, gaps. I used to think that if I could just explain myself better, they would understand. If I found the right words, the right achievements, the right version of myself, the gap would close. But over time, I realized that the gap wasn't caused by misunderstanding. It was caused by indifference. They didn't dislike me. That would have required effort. I simply didn't register the way the others did. I learned early how to observe instead of participate, how to read the mood of a room without becoming part of it. I noticed patterns, routines, who spoke first, who was deferred to, who was allowed to take up space. I learned that some people are born central to the story, and others are expected to orbit quietly. When I was younger, they called it a phase. Later, they called it wasted potential. And that night, they finally gave it a name. A mistake. The year that followed was the hardest and quietest of my life. I stopped showing up to family events. At first, I made excuses. Work. Fatigue. Scheduling conflicts. Eventually, I stopped explaining at all. Invitations came less often. No one asked why I was distant. Distance suited them. I moved out of my small apartment and into a cheaper one closer to the ocean. A place with thin walls and the constant sound of waves in the distance. I took on extra hours at work, not because I needed the money immediately, but because being busy was easier than being alone with my thoughts. I worked in administrative support at a private clinic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I handled scheduling, insurance forms, billing questions. I learned how systems worked, how money moved, how problems were solved quietly, without drama. I was good at it. What I liked most was that the work had rules. Forms either matched, or they didn't. Numbers reconciled, or they didn't. Problems had causes, and causes had solutions. There was no guessing how someone felt about me. No hidden tests I didn't know I was taking. When something failed, it wasn't personal. It was procedural. And fixing it didn't require charm or confidence, just attention. That suited me. No one at work knew my family well enough to judge me by them. They knew me as reliable, calm, capable. When something went wrong, people came to my desk. I liked that. I liked being useful without having to perform. Slowly, without planning to, I began to build something separate from them. I saved carefully and methodically. I didn't tell anyone when I paid off my student loans. I didn't post about the small emergency fund I built, the second one after that, the third that eventually became something more solid. Late at night, I read quietly, teaching myself how numbers connected, how decisions compounded. I learned how not to need them. There were moments when the word came back to me, in the shower, while lying awake, when someone asked about my family, and I gave vague answers. Mistake echoed softly in my head, not as an insult anymore, but as something I refused to carry. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want validation. I wanted distance. Almost exactly a year after that dinner, my phone rang while I was at work. It was my mother. I stared at the screen longer than necessary before answering. We hadn't spoken in months. Not properly. Just a few short messages on holidays, polite and empty. Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered. She said that we needed to talk. Something in her tone told me this wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about missing me. It was about a problem. She asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. I agreed, even though every part of me tensed. Curiosity outweighed fear. We met 2 days later at a cafe near the marina. She looked smaller somehow, older. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her cup. She didn't waste time. There had been financial trouble. Investments that went wrong. A business deal that hadn't been properly reviewed. My father had trusted the wrong people. My sister had pushed for decisions that were rushed. They needed help. Not emotional support. Not forgiveness. Help that was practical and immediate. They needed someone who understood paperwork, numbers, deadlines. Someone calm. Someone who could fix things quietly. Someone like me. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not pride, not affection, need. She told me that I was good with this kind of thing, and that I always had been. I listened without interrupting. I asked questions. I took mental notes. I saw the shape of the problem clearly, the way I always did. And for the first time, I realized something that made my chest feel strangely light. They didn't call me because they loved me. They called me because they needed me. And for the first time in my life, I understood that I could say no. The realization didn't arrive with anger or triumph. It arrived quietly, like a door I hadn't known existed finally becoming visible. I understood that saying no wouldn't make me cruel or selfish. It would simply make me unavailable. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty imagining that. 2 more years passed. I didn't plan to become wealthy. I just kept doing what I knew how to do. Working quietly. Understanding systems. Noticing what others overlooked. Avoiding emotional risks. Never spending money to prove anything to anyone. Management at the clinic changed, then changed again. Eventually, I was asked to take over financial operations, not announced and not celebrated, simply because I had already been doing the work. I said yes. My salary increased, then increased again. At the same time, I kept investing carefully, without gambling and without talking about it. The money didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated slowly and steadily, as if someone had turned a dial little by little, and the flow kept getting stronger. I bought an apartment. Not luxurious, but mine. Then I bought another as an investment. I didn't post photos. I didn't tell anyone in my family, or anyone at all, except the bank and the notary. When I left the clinic to build my own business, it happened quietly too. I opened a small consulting firm, helping businesses organize their finances and processes, doing what I had always done, only this time for myself. That was when they remembered me again. At first, it was accidental. A relative saw my name in a professional article. Someone else noticed a company registration. Someone heard about the property. My phone rang. This time the calls weren't careful or apologetic. They were cheerful, enthusiastic, curious. My mother spoke, as if we had seen each other yesterday. My father asked how I had managed it. My sister wrote that she had always believed in me. They became a family again the moment I stopped being a problem. They suggested dinners and trips. Said that everything back then had been wrong. That no one had meant any harm. I listened and felt an unexpected calm. Because now I could see it clearly. When I had nothing, I was a mistake. When I had something valuable, I became an opportunity. We met once, at a restaurant they chose. Everything was polite, beautiful, almost perfect. My sister smiled too widely. My mother held my hand longer than necessary. My father talked about family and the future. At some point, I realized they were waiting. Not for words, for a chance. I finished my drink, stood up, and said that I had to leave. No one called me a mistake that evening. No one asked how I had actually lived all those years. When I walked out, I understood that I felt nothing. Not anger, not pain, not the need to prove anything. I didn't become their solution. They never became my family again. And for the first time, that felt like peace.